Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. The last few weeks have seen a flurry of diplomacy on Ukraine. First, we had the US 20-point plan, or was it a US plan, which Russia seemed delighted with, but then Ukraine pushed back on really hard. Then last week, Ukrainian and US officials met in Florida to discuss a new plan. And then this week, Starmer hosted Zelensky and other European leaders to put on a show of unity on Ukraine. But then in the middle of this, we also had the new US national security strategy, which has sent shockwaves through Europe. It warns of civilizational erasure happening in Europe. It says Europe's not doing nearly enough on defense. And I was just at the Doha Forum where the US ambassador to NATO said, and I quote, "Is Europe a dynamic economy that can grow? Or is it just a museum that's a relic of the past and we just go and see the cathedrals and the lovely wines and cheeses and beers and waffles in the case of Brussels?" So there's some harsh language coming out of this administration about Europe. So as the underlying relationship between the US and Europe continues to shift, what should we expect from the talks on Ukraine? Are the contours of a ceasefire deal starting to emerge? Or is this transatlantic crisis coming to a head, which will drive a wedge between Europe and the US and further make it less likely that we will see a deal? Today, we are joined by our two leading experts on both Europe and Russia, Max Bergmann and Maria Snegovaya. Max, you haven't been on for a little bit, but you are our most regular guest of State of Play, so I barely need to even introduce you. But
great to be back, Will.
Thanks
for having me back finally.
Yes. Now, you have just put out a piece arguing that the national security strategy could destroy the Transatlantic alliance. So my guess is you're probably not going to be a little ray of sunshine in this conversation.
I don't think so, no.
Okay. All right. Well, we're prepared. That's okay. And Maria Snegovaya is Senior Fellow in the Europe, Russia and Eurasia program, focusing on Russia and Eurasia. And it's your first time on State of Play. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And you have just come back from Europe. You were in both Berlin and Oxford, I think having conversations on Russia and Ukraine. So really excited to hear more about the vibe in Europe and just how alarmed they really are there. So maybe I can start by asking both of you where negotiations stand at the moment. What is the state of play on the negotiations?
Well, I think it's yet another round of intensified President Trump's effort to push forward some sort of settlement between Russia and Ukraine. We've seen that happen before. At this point, I think it's the third or fourth effort. And this time, I think is distinct in a way that the pressure on President Zelensky is really enormous, coming from the US administration. We have seen that, however, the key issues that remain unresolved are very much the same as we have seen before. And they have a lot to do with specifically territory, the rest of Donbass, whether Ukraine would be willing to concede it to Russia, but also security guarantees for Ukraine. There was also the status, interestingly, of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant mentioned, among others. But altogether, there is broader issue as to, frankly, what we want to do with this war, I would flag, because and it's very understandable for many observers that no sort of current settlement is going to be, unfortunately, the end. Putin will just regroup, reconstitute, and re-attack. The only question whether it's going to be Ukraine or Europe, or like maybe NATO at this point, but the question whether, it's not really the question whether he will be attacking. Moreover, we'll also flag that in our work with Max, we point out that even some sort of settlement which would maybe stop Russian military advances on the front line will still allow Putin a possibility to continue strikes potentially on Ukraine. So even a settlement achieved on paper will not be the end of this war. Lastly, Putin feels relatively emboldened, so it's really unclear whether he would be willing to sign any sort of agreements that are not fully beneficial for Russia. Altogether, I don't think much have changed other than the renewed willingness of the U.S. administration to put additional pressure on Zelensky. And in combination with the frontline situation where Ukraine is slightly losing the ground basically the disarray in the Transatlantic alliance, I think that gives the Kremlin an upper hand.
That's interesting. I hadn't had that piece about an agreement not necessarily, or a ceasefire deal not necessarily ending the attacks. That's certainly what we've seen in the part of the world I focus on in the Middle East, where ceasefire in Gaza, ceasefire in Lebanon, and yet there are almost daily attacks. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the big question over this last year was, is Russia at all interested in stopping the war? And the Trump administration's bet, or their thought, was that this was sort of, Ukraine and Russia were both sort of fighting, and this was really about territory. And as they put pressure on the Ukrainians would fold, or they would be forced to fold, and that they could offer economic incentives to the Russians. And, I guess it was worth a shot. But what we've seen is that the Russians really don't have an interest in stopping the war because they think they're winning. And what happened here is it looked like the Russians, in some ways, compromised in some areas. The 28-point plan that Steve Witkoff produced was not, had some things that you're like, okay, maybe this could be the foundation for beginning to reach an agreement. But then what was the whole bizarre part of this is that the Trump administration then sent officials to Kyiv to say, you must agree to this deal by Thanksgiving. And Kyiv's like, we can't agree to this because there's all this weird stuff in it. And then it turned out that the Russians actually hadn't really agreed to this. So what is, I think, happening here is the Russians sort of threw out this deal that made it look like they had made some concessions in the hopes that the Trump administration would blame Ukraine for not agreeing to peace. And then they could sort of open these side deals with Trump and with the administration on economic issues. All the while, they're just continuing the war. And you could sort of see Trump wanting to engage with Russia and sort of move Ukraine to the side. So it was a safe bet. The Ukrainians have sort of responded effectively. Rubio stepped in again, just like he did in the spring. And so we're kind of back where we started, where there's no end in sight into this war. Russia thinks it's going to win. U.S. military aid to Ukraine has basically is drying up because there's no more funding. And the U.S. has less of a role in it. But Russia thinks it's winning. So until Russia thinks it's not winning, I don't really see why Russia is going to, come into the negotiating table and make a lot of concessions.
And I saw a map recently that showed the territorial gains that Russia has made in Ukraine over the last year or so. And at least in the context of Ukraine as a whole, it's tiny, right? Like it's very small.
There's actually an estimate that at the current rate of progress, it will take Russia approximately 250 years to occupy the rest of Ukraine.
Wait, really? Wow.
So okay. Exactly. So yes, but unfortunately, that's not necessarily how Putin sees the situation.
Yeah, and you could also look at the front lines in World War I and say, okay, this is crazy. Because it was crazy that, especially on the Western Front, both sides are just pounding each other and there's no real movement. And then suddenly at the end of the war, there was a lot of movement. The Germans were outside of Paris and then the lines moved back and forth. So I think what Russia's thinking is, if you just keep pounding, eventually you're going to attrit the front line so much that maybe you can break through, maybe then force Ukraine to actually just, yell uncle and submit. So, we know what it's like to be in long wars that don't really have a clear endpoint. But if there's sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, if there's a sense of like, oh, actually, if we just keep going in this direction, we can win, whatever that means. And so I think that's kind of where Russia is. And the hope is that maybe relatively soon they start to say, okay, this is not going so well. But I think the last point is I don't think we should view this as a binary between war and peace. It's not like if Russia decides they can't really win the war, then their next best option is to have a negotiated settlement that then allows Ukraine to have a European future. I think the next best settlement is you just keep launching missiles into Ukraine. They can do that endlessly. And you basically hold your ground on the front line. You don't really try to take more territory. So that's not good for Ukraine. It's probably better than the current situation, but I think that's something we have to note.
And if I can jump in here, just a reminder that really this war is not about territory for Putin, right? The ultimate goal is to subordinate Ukraine one way or another. And if that is not achievable, given the, amazing courage and commitment of the Ukrainian people, then the second best option would be the demonstrative effect to what happens to the states that refuse to get subordinated by the Kremlin, unfortunately. And that means constant, maintaining the sense of uncertainty for Ukraine, right? There's no investment climate, no opportunity to rebuild. Hopefully, from the Kremlin perspective, also cutting off Ukraine from the sea axis, which will radically hurt its economy. So essentially converting Ukraine as sort of Moldova, landlocked, poor country without any possibility of the future and no integration with the West.
And is, as part of that subordination campaign, is political change in Ukraine something that you think Russia is really confident about or pushing for?
Very much so. And as you can see in all the so-called Russian versions of this agreement, the idea of holding elections in Ukraine within a certain time after this settlement is achieved always keeps coming forward. Putin keeps making this claim. He also constantly refers to the origins of the conflict, which also in the Kremlin speak, the idea that Ukraine is essentially allegedly controlled by some neo-Nazi regime and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So basically, this is something that is quite consistent. And by the way, a direct violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, because who are we, to dictate Ukraine when and under what circumstances it should be holding its elections?
I do want to bring this back to the national security strategy as well. Do you think the national security strategy really changes how Ukraine is viewing these negotiations? Does it feel particularly weak in this moment and even more pressure on it? Or do you think it's able to kind of withstand and it's going to try and forge closer partners with Europe, get Europe to stand up? Where do you see that?
I think for Ukraine, looking at the national security strategy, I think it kind of just confirmed to them what they kind of knew, which is the Trump administration does not really see Russia as a major threat. Russia is not treated as a major threat in the document. And it talks about how it just sort of wants the end of this war. There's no real mention of democracy and supporting democracies under threat in the document. Actually, the only time democracy is really mentioned is in the Europe section, but how, Europe is undermining democracy because it has tech regulations. So, but we can get to that. But so there isn't this sort of any attachment to Ukraine in this document, in stark contrast to the previous national security strategy, which talked about supporting democracy and standing up for American values. So I think that not being in the national security strategy in some ways is not shocking. The Trump administration has telegraphed that. Trump, when he spoke at the UN Security Council and other foreign policy speeches, has not mentioned the word democracy. But I think for Ukraine, it demonstrates that there's no real interest of this administration in supporting its war effort. At least, it's not going to look for more funding for Congress. And it's clear they're looking for the exits in America's involvement in this.
Yeah, I will just add that obviously instead of emphasizing the integration of Ukraine, right, the strategy emphasizes the ending the war in Ukraine as the core interest, which is a big difference. And we see that the effort to end the war is there, given the intensified pressure. But unfortunately, it comes at the expense of Ukraine because the pressure goes primarily on Ukraine, on Zelensky. And I have to flag that President Zelensky is clearly under enormous pressure. I think it's quite admirable the way he is able to handle the situation, try to still maintain no territorial concessions because they're actually against Ukrainian constitution, among other things. And I think it's quite concerning that the Kremlin welcomed the strategy and effectively, again, within this disinformation campaign that it runs against the West, basically tried to emphasize that it is supports Russian interest.
So, Maria, I wanted to ask you about the Russian response then to that. So you just said that that Moscow welcomed the national security strategy. Do you think this causes any kind of shift in Putin's strategy to Ukraine, or does it just cause it to double down even more on what you've already mentioned as the strategy?
I think that Putin can be accused of many things, but one thing he's not is inconsistent. I think he's very consistent in his goals, unfortunately, over a very long period of time. And if we took his many of his words more seriously before, maybe we would have been less surprised afterwards. I think the strategy, in a lot of ways, classic right-wing populist foreign policy, in the sense that there's no ideological aspect, is purely substituted by more tactical considerations, and that is a problem in the sense that it is both not good for transatlantic alliance, and literally the main threat as presented by the strategy is Europe rather than the actual threats that are out there like Russia or China. And the emphasis is basically on more pragmatic considerations that by default eliminate the possibility of a certain strategy. In the moment where we need a more consistent aligned strategy within the Western powers more than ever. And that is certainly highly concerning, but from Putin's perspective, it's just in a lot of ways a confirmation of what he's been telling or anticipating for a while, that the Western alliance will eventually crumble. In a lot of ways, I think they feel like their priors are reconfirmed, and that, if anything, just makes them double down on their demands. And for that reason, just as Max flagged before, I don't think we should be anticipating any major concessions from the Kremlin.
Mm-hmm. So you've both now said that in some ways the national security strategy confirms what Putin already believed and also confirmed what the Ukrainians already believed about US strategy on Ukraine. How about the Europeans? Did it confirm what they already believed? Because Maria just said Putin is very consistent on his goals and on his rhetoric about Ukraine, but you could say the Trump administration has been pretty consistent in being very critical of Europe, going back to Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he was really critical about European civilization, I think, and migration and how it's changing Europe. Max, what are you hearing from Europeans about how much of a shock this was to them?
So I think this was quite shocking to them. Frankly, it was shocking to me as someone who tracks this, in part because if you had probably asked me prior to the NSS, like, what was it going to say about Europe? I think I would have said, well, it's going to deprioritize Europe. It's going to say Europe doesn't matter that much. Maybe it'll mention something about European regulation. But what this is a real civilizational, to use their term, attack on Europe. And what's interesting about it is instead of deprioritizing Europe, it actually does the opposite. It says Europe matters so much to us. We need it so much that it's civilizational collapse and decline, which is fueled, it's sort of implicit in there by wokeism and migration, and that Europe basically being very small L liberal and not and being sort of anti-far right is leading to the collapse of Europe. And so what's surprising about this document is it says, well, not that the U.S. should walk away. It does say that militarily. It confirms the Pentagon got their lines in there about burden shifting and about how, Europe needs to take care of itself. But then what it says is that actually the U.S. needs to do something about it. In fact, what it calls for is, quote unquote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. That is a call for political interference in European politics. And it also says, on behalf of the parties and movements that are, essentially the far-right nationalist parties in Europe. And I think that's deeply concerning for Europeans, or at least should be, because that is, basically saying the U.S. needs to use its immense power to intervene in European politics. And, we've done that in the past. In the early days of the Cold War, we have this thing called the CIA. We have an intelligence community that used to do a lot of political interference. They've sort of gotten out of the game, so they don't really, I think are experienced in it. We also now have a lot of State Department funding that has been freed up as we've canceled democracy programs and USAID and other things. So I think this is going to lead, or this is signaling or telegraphing that the U.S. is going to be doing a lot in European politics. And when you mess in other countries' politics, those politicians, and almost all Europe's politicians, their political leaders are center-right, center-left, or centrist leaders, are going to be really pissed off. So I think this is essentially opening potentially a gaping wound in the transatlantic relations that I'm not sure is going to heal if the strategy actually gets implemented. And I think there's every reason to believe that it will.
And I mentioned I was just at this forum in Doha, and I have to say, from the Europeans that I heard speak, it felt very reactive, everything they were saying. I mean, a lot of this conference was focused on the Middle East, and it seems like Europe really doesn't have a clear sense of what it's trying to do there. But even within...
Do we, Will? I'm sorry.
Well, okay,
Sorry,
yeah, okay. Maybe that's another podcast. But it's... Well, anyway, yes.
sorry.
Yeah. But like, Max, like, what do you expect to be the European response to this? Is there a chance that finally this prompts a kind of European unity to actually push back and actually have a strategy to deal with it?
So I think the implications of this are pretty significant because, look, it looks like the transatlantic relationship is going through a divorce. The United States has sort of indicated that very clearly where it wants to go. You mentioned J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. This is sort of the strategy really reflects that. I think Europeans were like, well, that speech was done 2 weeks into the administration, new VP. Maybe this is just sort of they're a little out over their skis. And there were some signs that things had sort of calmed down. And what the Europeans are sort of split between those that are saying, this is a divorce, it's over, we have to focus on ourselves. And those that are saying, oh, they just batted their eye at us again. Like, oh, America was nice to us here. Maybe it's not over. And it's, in any relationship, there's those that recognize it's over, and one part of you may recognize it's over, another part wants it to continue. So that's what Europe has been going through, and we have been sending some mixed signals to them. We haven't been totally coherent, but this is, I think, pretty coherent, a pretty clear signal. And I think what this does is indicate to the Europeans that the kind of bending the knee strategy to Trump, the calling Trump Europe's daddy, may have worked a bit on the president, but this is not the first term, right? The first term, the deep state, the bureaucracy, the first national security strategy was basically a traditional Republican national security strategy. And they wanted things to continue. In this case, the deep state, the bureaucracy are now controlled by the Trump movement, by the Make America Great movement, by believers that Europe is a real problem, that they need to act. And so the relationship with Trump that European leaders have built up does not save you from the deep state, from the bureaucracy. I think what Europeans will realize is that the bending the knee didn't quite work. When they caved on trade, they sent a signal of weakness, and Trump just gave a political interview to Politico, where he said, Europeans are weak. There's an assumption they can push them around. Wickoff, had all these provisions that basically was going to take money from the EU and give it to US companies without even talking to the Europeans. So what is Europe getting for this weak posture? I think they're going to ask themselves that. And my guess is that we're going to start to see a much stronger response because the EU itself is ready to hit back. And I think is likely to do that.
Okay. Interesting. And Maria, as I mentioned at the start, you were just in both Germany and the UK, and I wonder how all of this shapes Europe's stance on Ukraine and on these negotiations. Do you think Europeans have any ability to shape a deal on Ukraine at this stage?
I think that unfortunately a lot of leverage seems to be being lost, and altogether the sense of loss, I would say, is something that characterized the discussions that I attended. A lot of the basically bandwagoning and attempt to bandwagon what has been already preset by the United States. And the general perception that Europe would eventually have to sort of agree with the peace talks outcome, even if to the extent that they can, while trying to shape that outcome to the extent that they can, right? And I think this week, Zelensky traveled into Europe, trying to, again, renegotiate, propose an alternative to the 28-point plan is within that framing. But unfortunately, this stage basically is being set by the United States. I would love to see a little bit more of the understanding of this divorce, as Max described it, and a little bit more of the strategic thinking. So I think that 4 years into this war is long overdue because ultimately the crisis is on the border of Europe. It's not on American border. So that is the sense I'm getting. And even if I think it deserves a lot of credit for all that has been done, like German perspective on Russia has changed tremendously. And there are, I think, opportunities to be used. For example, when it comes to sanctions, like the SWIFT thing, everything that can be done with that, the frozen reserves, and going after the scheduled fleet, all of that within the European realm. So potentially they can double down. It's also quite you can see that they really intensified the purchases of the weapons from the United States. But again, much still lives to be decided.
Maybe just a quick point that one of the best terms I've heard recently is that Europe has been conducting, quote unquote, track changes diplomacy. Huh. So they've been getting these plans from the US and then they kind of come in with their changes. And what this reflects, everyone's like, European fecklessness and weakness. Look, that has been by design, right? Because they've just been able to rely on the United States. We have liked this, that they didn't need to have a common foreign policy, a common defense policy. And in fact, if they tried to do it, we said, don't do it. We said, EU, no. And so what they have is kind of a messy situation right now, where when 21 drones are fired by Russia into Poland, perhaps the greatest attack on NATO soil, there's no red phone in any European capital to then call Moscow. So who talks to Moscow? Who signals to Russia? So Europeans need to, think about how they're structured to both support Ukraine. That's going to require doing a lot on the financial side. They have the wealth and leverage. They just need to do so collectively. And that's what the reparations loan. Who is going to talk to Russia? That's something they'll need to figure out. And then how do they potentially structure their defense? Do they just do it as a bunch of, 27, 30 countries that are all somehow going to congeal together to fight? Or do they have to begin to integrate their militaries? These are all really tough questions that they're grappling with. And they were hoping to sort of stick to the status quo. And what the NSS does and Trump sort of playing footsie with Putin, it indicates to the Europeans that like, okay, I think maybe we're on our own. And so it's not that Europe has done nothing. There's a lot actually happening. The EU has 150 billion euros that it's suddenly spending on defense, which would have been completely shocking, 3 years ago. So stuff is happening, but it's like with everything, you want what is happening to happen faster and at bigger scale. And I think we'll begin to see that.
I want to end by asking what you think we should be looking out for going forward. If we were to get closer towards a deal, what signs do you think would start to emerge that something is imminent?
I think the key here is we will probably see some willingness to make concessions, verbally at least, on territorial concessions on Ukraine side, primarily in Donbass, because this has been just a major stumping stone of the block for the negotiations. That would be my answer.
I think we'll start seeing more Ukrainian missiles flying into Russia. We're seeing drones fly into Russia and cause some real damage. They don't have a huge payload. But so if Ukraine is able to really bring this war to Russia, I think that is the kind of key trigger for perhaps that begins to alter the Kremlin's calculus and really Putin's calculus about how sustainable this is, because the thing he's most worried about is his regime survival, and combine that with an economy that's still okay, but relatively shaky, then I think that could begin to change how Russia is approaching these talks. And then we'll hopefully see what Maria pointed to.
Yep. Okay, so then the rapid fire round of questions at the end. So the first one, can you sum up where Europe and Ukraine are going after the NSS in one word? Max?
Together. And I think that's both for Europe and Ukraine. There's already been a big effort to sort of bring the Ukrainian defense industrial base into Europe's defense industrial base. And I think what Europe and Ukraine are seeing is that Ukraine needs Europe. Europe needs to support Ukraine. And I think that's what we're going to see after this.
Yeah, I agree. And I would frame it perhaps as strategic autonomy. This is the opportunity for Europe to finally grasp it, something that has been one of the rhetorical points, but finally came true, but unfortunately not under the best circumstances.
So then our kind of great power competition question of the US, Russia, and China, although we haven't mentioned China, so probably of the US and Russia, who is up the most this week and who is down? Who's had a good week?
I mean, I think I would go Russia.
Yeah.
They they didn't quite get what they wanted with the kind of the merry-go-round with the talks, which they were hoping. I think the U.S. would throw something heavy at Ukraine, and Russia would be able to negotiate with Trump. But the national security strategy has created a real wedge in transatlantic relations. It sort of adopts Russia's worldview, which is why you've had Dmitry Peskov and others sort of embrace it. So I think for Russia, they're going to be thrilled about this national security strategy.
I will flag that former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev happily aligned with Elon Musk on Twitter in criticism of the EU tech regulations, which is particularly ironic given that Twitter is blocked in Russia, but somehow they still find it possible to align in how restrictive the EU is.
Okay, so then your chance to ban a word or a phrase from this conversation, or just more broadly, Maria, what annoys you? What do you wish people would stop saying?
My pet peeve is sanctions do not work because they're actually very effective right now as we speak. Russia is actually facing recession, and this is, of course, sanctions could have done better. They were never meant to stop the war, but they're certainly delivering. And if only we have seen more pressure to enforce secondary sanctions, primarily from the United States, I think we were likely to see more change, negative change coming in Russia.
I think the word I would pick would be civilizational, which is in the NSS, and it talks about civilizational erasure, civilizational erasure of European culture. I go to Europe all the time. They seem to be doing quite well. It's just that Europe economically doesn't have a thriving tech sector. And so what are they doing? Well, they're focused on how do they create an integrated capital markets. And that would require the EU to do it. So they have these big pools of venture capital. So European startups don't get bought out by American companies as much anymore. But their economy is not like collapsing. Like there's a sort of narrative about civilizational decline that I think really needs to go because it's just not true. And that's why Americans are traveling to Europe in hordes to see all these beautiful churches as great cuisine. But
wines,
it's also
cheeses, beers,
and functioning infrastructure. So I think for our tech community, the fact that Europe doesn't have like a huge thriving tech community means that they're failing. But there's like more to life and more to an economy than a thriving tech sector. It's a problem, but I would delete civilization from the NSS.
All right. So when talking about where things are with Russia and Ukraine, you've talked about how there's enormous pressure on Zelensky at the moment, that the Russians don't want to stop the war because they think they're winning. And you said that Putin is feeling really confident. And so this might just grind on. And Maria, I think you said, this is not about territory. This is about subordinating Ukraine. So then when we come to the NSS, I think you said, in some ways, this confirmed what Ukrainian and Russian leaders already believed about the US strategy. But for Europe, this was a huge shock, Max. And again, you talked about how it's a civilizational attack. There's one part that was more expected on the burden sharing, but the call for political interference is something that is sending shockwaves through Europe. And so maybe now we are moving towards this divorce. And a feeling that the strategy that Europe has taken with the US, bending the knee, is not sufficient anymore, and that we might see a stronger response from Europe. And I think you used the term the track changes diplomacy, that Europe can't rely on the US anymore, and they can't delay some of these really difficult questions as well. And so then in some ways the stage has been set by the US. But then you've talked about how Europeans do still have a lot of tools to bring to bear. Maria, you said sanctions do work, and there are all these other measures that the Europeans could take to increase pressure on Russia. Looking forward, whether this does begin to bring about a deal or not, Maria, you said we would see probably a verbal acceptance of territorial concessions from Ukraine being a sign that things might be coming towards a deal. And then Max, you said, it might actually be on the pressure side, more Ukrainian missiles hitting Russia, putting more military pressure on Russia. So we will have to watch forward, see if those things happen. But it has been a huge week for transatlantic relations, for Russia, for Ukraine. And thank you so much to you both for helping walk our audience and me through this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.